This is Curious Minnesota, a Star Tribune project that sends staff from the state's largest newsroom hunting for the answers to great questions we receive from you, our readers. We're here to answer everything you want to know about the state's people, places, and culture.
Welcome to Curious Minnesota. I'm your host, Erica Pearson. This episode of Curious Minnesota is sponsored by Primrose Schools. I'm recording today's show on a day that is so extremely cold, many Minnesota schools shut down. It was minus 18 degrees this morning at the Minneapolis-St. Paul Airport. But today, we're going to talk about a day that was more than 3 times colder than that. And that's without factoring in any wind chill. It was the coldest day recorded in Minnesota history. This question came to us from 10-year-old Miri Hahn during much warmer times at the State Fair last August. At the Minnesota Star Tribune booth, we asked fairgoers to vote on their favorite questions, and hers proved to be very popular.
What's the coldest Minnesota has ever gotten?
Thanks so much to Miri for this great question. I'm here today with my colleague Casey Darnell, who wrote about Minnesota's coldest day for Curious Minnesota. Welcome, Casey. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
It's great to have you here. And I'm wondering if we could just start by having you talk a little bit about your job at the Minnesota Star Tribune and what drew you to this question.
Yeah, so I'm actually not a reporter. I work on the audience side of things, trying to get people interested in our amazing content that we have. I'm actually from Florida, so Minnesota was kind of scary to me before I moved here, just thinking about the extreme cold that we can have here. So when I saw a reader had asked what the coldest Minnesota's ever been is, I was immediately drawn to that. I needed to know what the answer was because I haven't experienced cold like this since moving here, and it's been a very interesting experience, very cold compared to what I grew up with in South Florida.
Yeah, what do you think the coldest is that you've personally experienced so far?
Probably about -10, and that's the actual temperature, not like feels like, so it's probably a bit colder than that.
Yeah. So tell us, what is the record?
The record is actually -60. It was set February 2nd, 1996 in Tower, Minnesota, which is a small town about 90 miles north of Duluth, so up near the Canadian border.
And on the following day, the Star Tribune put a giant minus 60 degrees on the front page. So this was a big deal that it was this cold.
Yeah, a ton of reporters descended on the town. There was a bunch of weather nerds there. People had kind of descended on this very small town to witness this record-breaking weather. It had been about 100 years since the temperature had reached this low, so it was a huge deal.
What was some of the things that happened? What did you find in the Star Tribune archives?
So the Star Tribune had a reporter up there in Tower. Larry Oakes was there, and he had reported that an Andover man added atmosphere by driving nails with a banana, and Ely natives spit skyward to test Jack London's promise that it would freeze in midair. It didn't.
It sounds like it was like a whole crowd of reporters in this yard of the official temperature takers kind of camped out. And I enjoyed reading in your story that there actually was a nearby town that had kind of a cold weather rivalry with Tower. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so there's these 2 towns that are pretty close to each other, Tower and Embarrass, Minnesota, and they're always some of the coldest places in the state. And this day, as record-breaking temperatures were expected, there were 2 different groups of weather monitors, volunteers, I believe, who were there. And in the town of Embarrass, they were all set up to measure the weather, but a thermometer malfunctioned and they weren't able to get a reading. So the town of Tower, where they were measuring it, their thermometers worked. So their record was counted, and maybe the Embarrass record would have been counted, but the Weather Service didn't accept it.
Gotcha. And it wasn't exactly 60 that they read, 60 below. It was 59 and a half, right?
Yeah, it was actually 59.5, and the Weather Service rounded it to the -60 just to get that nice round number that has now sat in history for decades.
It turns out that Tower and Embarrass typically have some of the coldest weather in the state because their location in the Embarrass River Valley often collects a pool of more dense, heavy, cold air. And those local weather volunteers record the temperature each day and send it to the National Weather Service. They have to keep the thermometer up off the ground in a white box so that it isn't impacted by the sun, wind, or heat from the ground. We'll be right back.
At Primrose, our balanced learning approach means exploring academic skills and life skills, combining purposeful play with nurturing guidance from teachers, and setting children up for success in future classrooms. Learn more at primroseschools.com/Twin Cities.
And we're back. You talked with a climatologist who said that it might have been colder in Minnesota's history, but this is like the coldest recorded temperature.
Yeah, Pete Boulay, who's a climatologist with the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources, said that temperature keeping in Minnesota goes back to October 1st, 1872 at Fort Snelling. So we don't have any record of temperatures before that, and everything is just kind of anecdotal.
So you also looked into a few different ways of measuring record cold. Can you talk about some of those?
Yeah, and the reason why I wanted to look at this is because while the temperature dropped to -60 in Tower, it only stayed that way for a very short period of time. So in a typical Minnesota fashion, in just 6 days, the temperature rebounded to 48 degrees, which is 108 degrees of temperature change, which is pretty wild to happen within the span of a week. So I also looked at what the coldest winters are, coldest wind chill, and coldest month.
Gotcha. So tell us about some of those.
The coldest month in Minnesota history was January 1912, with an average of -9.5 degrees. And in Polk County, which borders Grand Forks, the temperatures dropped below zero for every single night of the month.
Yeah, cold times, cold times. You found that January was typically the coldest month in Minnesota?
It looks like January is typically the coldest month in Minnesota, and January in 1936 saw the coldest wind chill. It was a glacial -66 degrees, and as every Minnesotan knows, the wind chill can really make it feel a lot colder.
Yeah, that's the question. But what about the wind chill? And how about the coldest winter?
The coldest winter in Minnesota was actually over 100 years ago in 1874-75, when the temperature was an average of just 4 degrees.
Just 4 degrees for months on end.
And to compare that to recent weather, the coldest winter in the past quarter century was 2013-14 with an average of 9.7 degrees. So it's about 5 degrees higher. I don't know if that makes much of a difference.
Yeah, still pretty cold. But you found that these days we tend to be breaking records in the opposite direction, right?
Yeah, Minnesota has been warming a lot, in particular during the winter. The winter of 23-24 was the warmest on record in the Twin Cities, with an average temperature of about 30 degrees between December 1st and February 29th. And Christmas in Minnesota was warm enough that year to get a write-up in the New York Times.
That's right. And the ice shanties got moved off of Lake Harriet.
Yeah, and a lot of the winter activities that Minnesota is kind of known for and is an integral part of our culture was temporarily shelved because it just wasn't cold enough.
Gotcha. What do you feel like was the most interesting thing that you learned working on this?
As a Floridian, it felt kind of insane to me to imagine groups of people going all the way up to this small town in Minnesota to see what the weather was. It's kind of like it felt like a weather tourism event, but in the opposite direction from what I'm used to with the sandy beaches of Florida. People were really excited to be there to be a part of this history and witness that -60 temperature. And I just really enjoyed learning about the kind of shenanigans that went on with, trying to use a banana to hammer a nail in and things like that was just really fun.
Yeah, I'll have to look up how cold it needs to be for this to be possible and see if that's something I can experience someday, along with the freezing of jeans and standing them up in your yard and boiling water and tossing it in the air.
And what I love most about this story is just that Minnesotans will make fun out of anything. No matter what the weather is, Minnesotans will find an opportunity to have fun and enjoy it.
Yeah, it was very cool. The one individual who's quoted in the Star Tribune story as camping overnight in the yard of the temperature takers just to like make it extra wintry, I guess, it was hilarious. So did that negative 60-degree day break records nationally?
No, actually, North Dakota had already beaten us there. In 1936, North Dakota hit their 60 below day, and that set the record for a non-mountainous state.
Gotcha. But the winters here do rank among the coldest in the United States, right?
Yeah, Minnesota's winters are the third coldest in the U.S. behind Alaska and North Dakota.
Gotcha. Still behind North Dakota.
Unfortunately.
Ouch. Okay, well, that's it for our show today. Thank you so much, Casey, for joining us.
Thank you.
Okay, that's it for today's show. You can read all of our Curious Minnesota stories online at startribune.com/curious. Thanks to Matt Gilmer and Jenny Pinkley for editing this podcast. Got feedback for us or a question you'd like us to answer? Send a note to curious@startribune.com.
Thanks for listening to Curious Minnesota. We want to hear from you. Ask questions and read more stories online at startribune.com/curious. Our show is recorded at the Star Tribune's headquarters in beautiful downtown Minneapolis, and our music is produced by Matt Gilmer. If you like the show, please rate us on iTunes or leave a review. And until next time, stay curious.